I would like to give the floor to Larysa Denysenko. She's going to moderate the discussion. She's also Kateryna Levchenko, Viktoriia Litvinova, Kateryna Pavlichenko, Uliana Tokareva, Marharyta Sokorenko, and Cubbon have a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much, Irina. Dear colleagues, please take your seats at the panel. Hello, everyone. We are going to have a discussion which we can call like introduction. It's about international standards, international standards in justice, about gender sensitivity. And usually, I personally see them as some markers. We can develop roadmaps, we can use navigation, we can really use different tools, using GPS for our roadmaps. But so basically, if we talk about the sea and we need some beacons of light in the sea, so I believe that these beacons of light, these are international standards, because they give us light for us to see, not to be lost in this environment, in this area, and so that we can truly support dignity, sensitivity, fair treatment, human-oriented approach, and to use this human-oriented approach, that not to forget that the justice is exercised by people and it is about people. And as always, the introductory part takes longer than it's planned. I don't want to shorten coffee break, because it's very important to stretch and relax during the coffee break after you listen to some wise thoughts. So we had an agreement to speak up to 8 minutes, but I will ask you to be a bit shorter, so up to 6 minutes. And the rule is, and sometimes you don't feel how long you talk, just look at me. If I show that, it means that you need to finish your speech. And we can start. And I think we can now start to discuss our topic. I would like to give the floor to Kateryna Levchenko. Istanbul Convention has been ratified, and many standards on GBV we can definitely follow. And basically, the government functions take into account these standards. But at the same time, Ms. Kateryna, what is important to understand about policies, about practices, why the standards on GBV, why are they important, and what we need to rely on? Okay. Thank you very much, Larysa. Good morning, dear colleagues. It's an important topic, and without a doubt, it's very deep, and we need to discuss the whole range of issues about international documents and what is reflected in national documents, even though not all of them are reflected in national documents. And doing so, we will be able to achieve those goals that were mentioned in the previous panel. Because when we do all of this, we need to protect survivors and punish the perpetrators. And of course, certification of Istanbul Convention was an important step for Ukraine, because it is based on these principles and on the important principle of prevention. To say that we have human-oriented approach or survivor-oriented approach, it's easier to say than do. But what's important that this focus has changed. And now on the level of rhetoric and doctrines, we talk about this. And it's a big shift. And if you've been working in law enforcement for a while, you can feel this shift. And as there is cooperation with civil society, international partners, we can feel this shift. How can we make justice human-oriented? Let's think about the problem, about burden of proof. Who needs to prove that violence took place? The person who committed that or the person who was affected? The person who was affected. And if we use formal language, it means that the burden of proof is on the victim. But according to international standards, it's the opposite. So burden of proof, it's not an obligation of a survivor. It has to be a burden of the system of criminal justice and the person who committed this crime. In what way can we change the laws so that this important standard is implemented? Who can assist us? Who can take on this role to prepare those draft laws which help us do that? I will be really grateful, and my request to all of you is not rhetorical. Myself and our office and the Office on European Integration, we need this practical assistance. There are so many professionals in this room, so please approach us and help us with that. And the second aspect that I have to mention, and I have to say about this.
Gender policy, equal rights, men and women. So, of course, we have many challenges, a lot of stress, many losses. And people knowing no better to do with it, they only turn this pain into further violence, and that only perpetrates further violence. But let's not forget that one of the most important reasons of violence existing in society is inequality, is discrimination, is sexism, and they have not gone anywhere so far. And if we ignore rights of women or achieving gender equality, nurturing the culture of gender equality in all teams, also in law enforcement and the police, until then we won't be effective in achieving the goals that we set for ourselves in battling the violence. So the Ministry of Internal is doing a lot, and I thank Kateryna for your work, for the work of your colleagues in the National Police, in the State Border Service, in the Emergency, and the State Migration Service, the National Guard. But what is being done has to become much stronger, and there should be transition from quantity into quality. And it's also an important standard, which is an international and national standard at the same time. There are also many national documents adopted and working. So let's use them effectively. Thank you. Thank you, Kateryna. Indeed, the balance regarding presumption of innocence on one hand and presumption of trust on the other hand, that is what has to become that foundation that allows us to understand what is this balance that we need to strike and how we can strike that balance in terms of the proof of gender-based violent crime. There's Viktoriia Litvinova, Deputy General Prosecutor of Ukraine. I hope Viktoriia will be able technically to join us, so please, the word is yours, and please maintain 5 to 6 minutes of intervention. Hello, dear colleagues. I'm happy to greet you here, and I'm very happy to be on this event. And I'm happy that my speech is in this panel on implementation of the international standards in investigating the gender-based violence and crimes. Let me start by saying that unfortunately, gender-based and also home domestic violence is still widespread in Ukraine, and both men and women are frequent victims. An important step to prevent GBV has been ratification of Istanbul Convention, which the previous speaker mentioned already, but this implementation of international standards in investigating the gender-based violence is the response to the challenges that the affected people face in Ukraine. And the main objective is changing approaches with the affected people to facilitate the interest of the affected people. We have to think about the affected people and survivors who have to feel protected. Only then we'll be able to deal with this negative phenomenon. Despite the fact of wide-scale aggression of Russia against Ukraine, it's important to talk about these problems now. This negative thing has just resurfaced. The problem has been resurfacing. We've done a lot. We still have a lot to do. The resolution of this problem is only possible through introducing changes in national laws. Kateryna Pavlichenko said, so there were several draft laws. So we need to categorize in law the criminal offenses related to domestic violence and GBV. We have to codify it, since the legislators still haven't explained and properly interpreted these notions, which creates problems in interpreting the law and in practical qualification of these offenses. Besides, the domestic violence has to be persecuted more, has to be punished. There should be criminal liability for secondary crime, for second offense. I always raise another important question, and I want to use this opportunity in this panel discussion to communicate about the situation that is in the procedural code, which provides the possible signing of peace settlement in domestic violence only if initiated by the survivor, their legal representative, or their legal groups. So these are difficult and discussion-prone questions, but the existing laws do not provide the best standards in battling gender-based and domestic violence. They have to be reviewed, because in those cases where the person, which is a GBV survivor, there are all the grounds for peace settlement, and they want that, but they still have to initiate this procedure with the perpetrator, and that can lead to stigmatization of the survivor. So that is a question that has to be resolved. Either the legislators have to prohibit peace settlement or to allow the perpetrator to agree or not. And so the general rule of peace settlement should be described. So I'm not saying that the opinion of the affected person or survivor is not important. Of course, their consent is important, but the provisions of the law are still unclear why only the survivor can initiate the peace settlement. Because that, as I said, may and often leads to stigmatization. So that is in one of the draft laws for implementing Istanbul Convention. Plus, I want to dwell on another important issue. There are in particular changes the approaches to this category of cases to review them, even if there is no complaint filed by the survivor. It's a very practical issue because we should leave the old obsolete standards of private-public so I'm confident from my experience, from a number of cases that I've seen, it's important to provide a standard where it's irrelevant who is informing, who is notifying about the domestic violence. The law enforcement has to have opportunity to respond, even if the complaint was filed by the neighbors or people around who are not parts of family. We have a huge number of criminal cases that are dismissed because the survivor refuses to support the claim, sometimes through psychological pressure. As a consequence, the survivor files a counter-complaint, and so there's no liability for the perpetrators. So these cases should be outside of the scope of private. So often the survivors don't trust the law enforcement, and that's why they're hesitant to file a complaint. And we need to facilitate inevitable punishment for the perpetrators. Also, it's important to protect children who are witnesses to domestic violence, providing them social and psychological assistance, because in reality, not in every case these children are legally deemed as survivors, only if they're directly affected. But that standard contradicts the Istanbul Convention, and such negative situation impacts negatively children and doesn't serve to protect their rights and interests, which is the foundation of state policy in protecting children. So they need to real support of children who are witnesses of domestic violence with account with their age peculiarities, and also important, the most objective of our work, protecting human rights. With these new challenges in our reality, we have to work together. We have to work with civil society organizations, with law enforcement, with the legislators to improve the mechanism of protecting the GBV survivors. Exclusive, effective coordination of law enforcement facilitates identification and high-quality investigation of this category of cases, and bringing the perpetrators to criminal justice. And protecting the survivors. So thank you for your attention. Thank you, Viktoriia. In fact, Viktoriia has just described important legal questions and legislation questions. So hopefully during this discussion from 15:30 to 16:30, you will be able to work on these problems and challenges. I'd like to pass the floor to Kateryna Pavlichenko. Deputy Minister of Internal. I know, Kateryna, that you will have to go after this intervention. And so, thank you. The follow-up of what was just mentioned by Viktoriia Litvinova, who basically described the main challenges, I would like to add to this list. And I'm counting that these practical issues that we're talking about will become the topic of further discussions. Obviously, we are moving toward the Euro integration, ratification of Istanbul Convention by Ukraine during the war is the support of that. And there are a lot of questions that require resolution in the legislation now. So we talk a lot about legislation and draft laws that are being reviewed in the parliament or being prepared. One of such draft laws changes the criminal procedural code being designed by the Ministry of Internal and the Prosecutor General, involving human rights organizations, which serves to resolve a number of problematic questions. And I would to continue this list. I would say that another problem is responding to complaints coming from frontline zones, temporarily occupied zones, and you know full well about this. It can also be a topic for discussion over these 2 days. Another problem is when the perpetrator is IDP, and for this kind of perpetrator, there should be a separate subpoena or procedure to detain them. But there were the law doesn't allow to act against the person who has nowhere to live. First of all, we have to protect the survivor, but around the perpetrators who are IDPs, it is a challenge nowadays, which needs to be discussed. The interpretation of how systemic this problem is, and how systemic is the response. There is no definition of what systemic nature is in the criminal law, so there are different interpretation by the judges in interpreting this law, this norm, how systemic character should be interpreted. Another important thing is that only 80% of suspects in perpetrating domestic violence so 80% were not even detained. That's in the recent statistics. And we have to be aware that it impacts negatively the protection of survivors, and that means people are rather unprotected against this. So that requires an urgent and effective solution. Thank you. Thank you, Kateryna. So we now lay the coordinational route to the system of social protection. Uliana Tokareva, Deputy Minister of Social Policy. And we will talk about survivors, how the system of justice and its standards in social sphere, how they protect the survivors, and do you feel that the system of justice and you as social protection and social care indeed cares about the survivors of GBV? Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. And thank you for organizing this event. Honestly, I haven't seen so many law enforcers who, I would say, in such a social topic, engaged and interested in such a social related topic as GBV and domestic violence prevention. I think it's so valuable, your attendance here, because the international standards we keep talking about are, first of all, oriented to protect the rights of the affected people, access to information, justice, but on the other hand, they also say about the right of the affected population to support and social assistance in that time, so that the person is not left alone, so that they get qualified assistance and help, and they feel this resource and capacity to further fight for their right for protection and justice. And so this justice is very important for the survivors, for the affected people who were affected by GBV or domestic violence. And timely support from social services, from specialized services, it provides that necessary resource. We work a lot on providing this support, of course, and you probably know that initiated by the First Lady, Larysa Denysenko, who is focused on many relevant topics to this. So Ukraine has joined the partnership Larysa, and this document basically mandates us as a state to create support service. The Istanbul Convention also has these provisions that mandates Ukraine to create support network. And in response to that, the Ministry of Social Policy, together with partners, are working on exactly supporting this support network. Why is it important? Because when a law enforcer meets the family where gender-based violence happened, or domestic violence, they need to understand what comes next with this person, who it's going to be referred to, where they receive that necessary assistance. And that's where specialized services engage psychologists, social worker, and provide necessary support. So at the moment, we have more than 800 such services in Ukraine. Even during the large-scale invasion of Russia, that did not stop this support. And over the last year and a half, we created more than 200 such specialized services, and it's important to understand where they are located, how they work, how you can engage them in supporting the affected people. Also, it's very important for us so that the modern law also corresponds to these international standards. So we work with the colleagues here on amending the laws, and now in the parliament there is draft law which allows to harmonize the national legislation with international standards. And as previous speaker said, sometimes the current law does not allow for effective remedy, and so I read a lot of materials in these handouts. Other than the agenda, there are very important recommendations for every participant, for the authorities as well. And there are great references to international standards. So a big part of it is recommendations around children that we've mentioned a lot today. And that draft law that is now being reviewed and registered, and we hope that it will be reviewed by the parliament soon, it contains the norm for children. You know that there's a system, I don't know whose, which is support of the children who were witnesses of domestic violence or survivors. So we suggest this model, I don't know whose, to be regarded as a system of response to violence against children. So we can say that, yes, social policy is moving towards international standards, does account these standards in their work, and not only law enforcement or social support, social protection, or civil society separately. No, we are all together working to provide people access to their rights to support and protection. And it's so important that these discussions should happen not only on the national level, so that for every community there is a possibility to get support, to get protection, also from law enforcement and from civil society. So even with this large-scale invasion, we scheduled to develop the local support service for 2024, supporting them from state budget. And please, everybody, build these systems of support and interaction locally, because their efficacy has that has the result whether the people get their support or not. So during this talk, we talked about children. I want to remind you that after lunch, there will be a specialized discussion where children will be in the center of attention as part of the support for gender-based violence. I want to invite Marharyta Sokorenko, who is an ombudsman and European Human Rights Court of Human Rights. So you've talked a lot about the EU standards. There's also Istanbul Convention, which is considered a GBV Bible. But there are also solutions of European Court of Human Rights, which often allows to see how gender-sensitive approach is used in these cases. Marharyta, please, the floor is yours. Thank you, Larysa. Well, first of all, greetings to all the participants. I want to thank the organizers for raising so many important questions, for openly talking about these difficult issues and violence and GBV, in particular, justice around that. Of course, we've mentioned EU standards several times now, as well as European integration. And one of the key indicators here, what allows us to understand how well we are in maintaining these European standards, are the decisions of European Human Rights Court. It's a well-known institution. Our citizens often file complaints, and a lot of lost cases were lost because of the lack of structural support in Ukraine. And so to mitigate these problems and risks is a task. Unfortunately, in the recent years, the European Court has started getting complaints on domestic violence, and we have negative decisions against Ukraine in these cases. And the cause for these negative decisions is that the European Court recognizes a systemic structural problem in Ukraine, that our legal system is such that produces the system and supports this problem. There are not many such negative decisions in European Court, but they are harsh. So European Court shows us the problem and shows us the area to work towards. So there are several decisions that we have. So European Court of Human Rights indicates that any state, a democratic state with the rule of law, must create and provide a high-quality legal base that would have real effect in protecting people and children against domestic violence, not only to exist, but be effective. And when the European Court has reviewed the cases with complaints from Ukraine, the court says that we still have the problem in Ukraine when survivors of violence go to police, but they don't get a full treatment or complete refusal to respond. So that's why the European Court has stressed that when the survivors go to Ukrainian law enforcement courts, even if the problem seems superficial, it still has to be analyzed whether the violence actually took place that the complainant states. But if the complaint is corroborated, there should be assessment of the risk of the secondary violation, of secondary violence or repeated violence. So this number of cases is now under supervision of Cabinet Ministers of Council of Europe. It's a political body of Council of Europe, which supervises how specifically Ukraine commits and fulfills on delivery on the Convention of Human Rights. And it's great to hear that now the battle with the GBV and domestic violence is within the focus and priority of the General Prosecution Office and Ministry of Internal and the National Police. That the approaches change, of pre-court investigation, etc. So last year, they reviewed again the commitments of Ukraine in battling domestic violence. They provided positive assessment of ratification of Istanbul Convention in June 2022, encourage Ukraine to strengthen legislation to battle domestic violence and protect the affected people. But the legislation, and I want to stress that separately, the legislation we're talking about today and will continue to discuss today and tomorrow, it's not the only mechanism of battling this phenomenon. The Council of Europe stresses that other than legislation, we need to increase awareness of people around this problem and building more experts in this topic so that we are equipped to respond properly and protect people, because sometimes in my work I speak about challenges that the European Court identified, and they always say that the most important is our results that we report, and it has to be our positive result in protecting so that our people can find justice that they otherwise seek in the European Court, but they could find it here. Thank you. Thanks a lot. It's so important for the work is talking about these problems. These challenges can become topic for a discussion after lunch, because we need to focus on all these aspects, all these challenges. Currently, we proceed to the final speaker in this panel, John Cubbon, expert of the project of EU Pravo-Justice, lawyer from criminal justice, and John is going to overview the standards of criminal investigation. What are the international standards? What's their implementation when we talk about investigating cases related to GBV? Please, John.
Hello. I'm a lawyer from the UK, and I'm going to use the UK as a point of reference. It is actually very relevant. On the 1st of November of last year, both Ukraine and the United Kingdom became parties to the Istanbul Convention. They both, in fact, ratified it earlier, as has been mentioned, but it actually came into force for the two countries on exactly the same day. Because of the constitution in Ukraine, unlike the situation in the UK, the Istanbul Convention became then an integral part of the law in Ukraine. In July of this year, both states submitted reports to the Council of Europe in answer to certain questions on the implementation of the Istanbul Convention. Those reports are remarkably similar in that they give details of legislation, facts and figures, a great deal of activity. I don't want to be cynical. This process is valuable. Nevertheless, as we've heard already today here, and as would be said in any similar meeting in the UK, there are some fundamental difficulties that can't be just solved by becoming party to a convention or adopting an EU directive or passing legislation. Those problems are underreporting, low levels of conviction, insufficient response from the police, general attitudes in society that lead to ineffective application of the legislation. Nevertheless, in both countries, the legislation is important. The adoption of the convention is beneficial because it does at least blaze a trail, provide a standard that should be met. If we look at the actual legislation in the UK and Ukraine, in many respects, it corresponds to what's required under the Istanbul Convention. In both states, legislation was passed in advance of ratification to ensure compatibility as far as possible with the convention. Nevertheless, there remain problems. In the UK, there isn't really a proper crime of forced abortion or forced sterilisation. There's things cobbled together from a few ancient statutes. There are other problems as well, and I'm not going to talk about them today. I should be concentrating on Ukraine. We've heard from Viktoriia Litvinova about the difficulties of the conciliation agreement in criminal proceedings as applied in cases of GBV. There are other difficulties that others on the panel, Kateryna, Pavlichenko, and others have drawn attention to. The excellent shadow report that JurFem produced at the same time as the Ukrainian government produced their report on the implementation of the Istanbul Convention drew attention to certain deficiencies in the legislation, the lack of a crime of stalking, the fact that there isn't a proper legislative definition of sexual harassment, the fact that female genital mutilation is not defined in sufficient detail, and as I think has already been mentioned, difficulties in the definition of the crime of domestic violence. Nevertheless, I think things are moving in the right direction. you have legislation actually being prepared in your parliament that will move things forward. So all in all, one can be confident about the future and as in the UK, recognising that there are huge problems to overcome in terms of attitudes and practices. Thank you.
Дякую дуже. Це насправді фантастично.
Thank you very much. We are only 4 minutes over our time. You are a very experienced speaker. And I want to draw attention of the audience. If you didn't take any notes, we discussed from problems with definitions, changing of legislation, understanding or lack of understanding in courts of certain crimes. So I encourage you during the coffee break to discuss everything that we mentioned during the panel. Share your knowledge and then listen to other panels and then get engaged when we cooperate and discuss everything after the coffee break. Thank you very much